My name is Mohamed Abdel-Kader. I'm the Executive Director of the Stevens Initiative at the Aspen Institute. I'll tell you a little bit about the initiative in a moment, but just a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, silence the little technological devices you've got in your hands. Anything that makes a noise or buzzes, just flip the little silent switch on. Second thing is, if you're going to use that device and you want to get on social media, please use the hashtag Aspen Ideas, just to make sure I've got that right. And then lastly, at the end of the session, if you would, rank the session. They've asked us to make sure that everybody is ranking them in the app. The Stevens Initiative is a public-private partnership at the Aspen Institute. Our partners are the U.S. Department of State, the Bezos Family Foundation, the governments of the UAE and Morocco, as well as some technology companies you may recognize like Microsoft, Twitter, and Video. Our goal is to connect young people in the United States with young people in the Middle East and North Africa using technology. We've had almost 28,000 students participating in 2 cohorts of projects with the Stevens Initiative. And these students are not only developing empathy and learning to talk to one another across borders, but these students are also building skills for the 21st century. We have supported projects that have had cross-cultural dialogue inform biomedical engineering and public health. We've had young people who have had cross-cultural dialogue inform their entrepreneurship activities. We've had folks really dig into civic engagement and what it means to be a citizen in each of their countries, and it's really a beautiful thing to watch. If you get a chance, check out our website. It's www.stevensinitiative.org. There's some really exciting stuff there. And I also have to note that our good friend Mike Bezos is here with us today. Mike and Jackie have just been huge supporters of our program, but also just of youth in general. They've really shown a commitment. And Mike, I want to thank you so much for all that you've done. We have an amazing panel here today with some very distinguished guests who need no introduction. Their full bios are going to be in your app. But to my right is Zeenat Rahman, who is the director of the Inclusive America Project at the Aspen Institute and formerly of the U.S. Department of State, where she worked on some youth issues for Secretary Kerry and Secretary Clinton. Did I get that right?
You did.
Good.
Yep. Good
To her right is Bob Runcie, who is the superintendent of Broward County Schools in South Florida. Thanks, Bob. And to his right is Damon Drummer, who is the co-founder of Coderspace, which is a really cool operation in the south side of Chicago, and Damon will tell you about that in a little bit. Bob, I want to start with you. Quick question. You have held leadership positions in Chicago with Chicago Public Schools and now at Broward County. What have been some of the biggest obstacles to reaching underserved youth and really unlocking that potential? How do we set those kids up for success?
I think it starts with recognizing that our schools become reflection of society. So I would say perceptions, racism are some of the things that actually play into that. So you look at how schools are funded. I think it's somewhere over 70% of our schools today are segregated. I mean, you think of how long ago Brown versus Board of Education was, and we're as segregated in some areas, probably more so. The way we assign teachers and educators to school and school leaders, making sure that we have our best folks in those schools, that doesn't always happen. And I also will say that the needs that these kids come with that are especially those that are being impacted by poverty, means that we've got to shift the mission of public education from just being about academics to providing a host of social services, a variety of mental health services and supports. So the game's really changed significantly, and we need a new business model, if you will, for public education.
I appreciate that. Damon, you've been down in the trenches. You're working with students on the south side of Chicago. Tell us a little about Coderspace's leadership model. And one of the things that when you told me about the program, I was really excited to hear about how you're empowering those students to be change agents in their own schools.
Yep. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. So great to be here. So Coderspace is a computer science learning lab. We're a place where high school students gather over the summer. They spend 8 weeks with us. We focus on front end, which is JavaScript, which is a scripting language, HTML and CSS. And it's just an introduction to computer languages. We spend 8 weeks working on community projects. Selfishly this year, our community project is rebuilding the Coderspace web presence, right? I'm starting to get really greedy with the talent that we're developing. And so the students then go off and return to school and start a Coderspace at their school. And this is often happening before the school hires a computer science teacher. This is despite Chicago Public Schools having a computer science graduation requirement. So imagine that, there's a graduation requirement and there's no computer science teacher. So our students are being able to offer, it might not meet the credit requirement, but students are interested in learning about this stuff, right? And so of course, we work with them over the Saturdays during the academic year, and then we hire those students back to teach what? The next cohort of students who are launching more clubs. So that's how Coderspace works.
That's great. That's great. Now, Zeenat, I want to jump over to you for a second. Earlier in your career, you were with the Interfaith Youth Corps, and then when you were at the State Department, you worked on some global youth issues that were related to the interfaith community, and now obviously with the Inclusive America Project, you touched on those issues as well. What responsibility does the interfaith community have, or communities of faith have, in reaching those students who are just having a tough time?
So I think when you look at just communities where there are large populations of underserved youth, a lot of times it's the faith community that's there as a social safety net. It's the faith community that's there to provide a safe space for young people. An example from where Demond and I are both from, Chicago, is the Inner City Muslim Action Network. It's a social service organization that offers things like food pantries and behavioral health counseling and things like that. Motivated by Islamic principles, but for the whole community. And so I think you see a lot of examples of that right now. We're seeing at the border, unfortunately in Texas, with Catholic groups or Catholic charities are the ones who are some of the ones who are bringing in the families for a shower, a warm meal, and able to provide assistance to connect them back to their families. So the faith community, I think, has always been a really robust part of civil society. I think faith communities in the role of young people have a role to shape their young people's identity, obviously, and decide whether you teach young people of their faith in a way that's a bridge or a bubble. Is it a bubble that's an isolated experience that they have, or do you teach them how to bridge to other faith groups? And I think that in the work that we do at Inclusive America, which I'll talk about a little bit later, it's that bridging is that essential kind of skill that we need. And then you mentioned that I worked at the Interfaith Youth Corps, and really the premise of that organization is how do you give agency to young people to define their own narratives? And I think that idea of storytelling and agency and a sense of belonging is incredibly important at every age, but particularly for young kids. So
that's great. Yeah. That's important. Bob, I want to jump back to you because in the education world, we do talk a lot about equity and equity's role in education, and you've done a wonderful job at increasing the number of students enrolled in computer science programs, getting them ready for careers. Mm-hmm. You have increased the number of students dramatically participating in debate clubs you shared with me. What do you tell policymakers who say that we're not going to be able to reach all these students and really have the results that we need if we have this equity lens? How do you push back on that?
I say anyone that says that hasn't tried. It's not hard to do. I mean, what we do in Broward is our first guiding principle is around equity. So when we decide to put some innovative program or opportunity in our district, it doesn't go into a handful of schools in a certain neighborhood. It goes into every school. So consequently, we have some of the largest implementations of initiatives out there. So our debate program is in every high school. It's in every middle school. This year, we'd rolled it out to 31 elementary schools, and at the start of this coming school year, it'll be in 70 of them. We have over 12,000 students engaged in debate. And when you think of interdisciplinary skills that enable kids to be successful in life and work, debate is transformational. Being able to look at facts, real facts, alternative facts, being able to then take a position on it, analyze it, communicate it in front of people in time-pressured situations, it's just been great. Computer science has been another piece. A few years ago, we had maybe 300 kids that were taking computer science in the district. I can tell you this year, we've had over 50,000 students engaged in debate. We trained over 1,000, in computer science. We trained over 1,000 teachers in computer science, and we've just made it available from high school all the way down to elementary. And we integrate it into curriculum. I'll give you a couple examples. One is we've had some fourth graders that were working on some environmental science and looking at how invasive species impact the Everglades. So they actually wrote a computer game that does a simulation of when an invasive species, in this case the Burmese python, comes into the Everglades and what it does on the native populations. We had some high school students who were struggling with where to find the buses every day. So we have some very large high schools in Broward County. One of them, Cypress Bay, has 5,000 students in it. So there's just a whole sea of buses that show up every day, 70 to 80 buses, but they show up at different positions every day. So you can imagine going to an airport and you got 80 gates and you don't know which one your plane's at. You're just walking down trying to figure it out. So what the kids did, they developed an app that actually lays out where the bus is every day, and so they could look at their app and they could tell what position it's in, just like you would find a gate. So we've really empowered students. We try to make sure that what they're learning is relevant. Far too often what happens in, quote, these underserved, high poverty communities is that we strip out all the things that engage kids. So the arts, extracurricular, all these other learning opportunities, and we keep double dosing, triple dosing them in literacy and math, and they get turned off. We have got to continue to make those kind of investments and build capacity in those neighborhoods and those schools where kids need it the most. And so, again, having an equity agenda where all really means all is really, I think, the best way to get the results that you want. And we've seen that. We've got our highest graduation rates that we've had this past year since we've been tracking them. Our third grade literacy scores have been moving. In computer science, for example, we had more African American kids in Broward County sitting and taking the AP computer science exam than the entire rest of the state of Florida combined. So just give you an idea of how that works.
That's pretty awesome. So I want to build on that. And Damon, you've talked a little bit about how, like, recruiting students, right? And sometimes in that process, getting parents out of the way. Parents can sometimes be a barrier.
No, actually, some school staff
Well,
have been in the way. I know
open
we
up.
were.
How have you navigated
I
that?
talk fast.
Getting the adults out of the way.
Yeah, so so we recruit students. So this is why we're doing clubs. I'll get to that in a minute. So in Chicago, we have this culture of paying students to participate in summer programs, right? And you can make a strong case to do that. I think there's a very rational, argument that can be made, and I can understand why I would want to make sure that students can at least kind of forego getting a summer job and do some sort of enrichment opportunity. But that becomes the leading question. I remember the first time I went out recruiting for a summer coding program back in 2011. The first question that a counselor asked me was, "Well, how much do you pay?" I'm like, "Wait, no, that's not the right question." Right? And we'll go to schools and drop off flyers and talk to people, and they'll say, we don't know if anybody would be interested in this. The interesting thing is that the applicants that we get, some of whom are the very students that you would think would need the money, their parents don't say anything about a stipend, right? They know that this is now, and that their students, to be competitive, have to at least know that computer science is a thing. Yeah. So one grandparent said, "I will pay you to go to this instead of you working at McDonald's or going to that other program that's not going to teach you anything," right? Mm-hmm. And so we have parents bribing their students, right, to go or saying, "I got your bus card, we got this," right? And so we stand firm on that because we have a great network of families, but sometimes we feel like we have to work around local school staff sometimes, and that's not a knock on schools. It's just we've predetermined who would be interested in what, right? And we have to really work around that. So that's why we're so excited about these clubs, because we can go to a school that never sends any applicants, get one student out of there, and then that student's bringing students on Saturdays with them, right? And so you may not say, "Oh, I'm all over computer science," but I'm somewhat interested, and all of a sudden you realize that you're kind of good at it, and this is something that you can engage other disciplines with as well. So that's how we approach that.
I appreciate that. I'm going to jump back out to the international level, and Zeenat, come back to you. You spent some time at the State Department. As a diplomat, you got to see youth issues around the globe. And one of the things that's popped up in the last few years has obviously been the tragic situation of refugees around the world. I know you touched on some of those issues when you were at the State Department. Tell us a little bit about what you saw in terms of challenges and some of the things that made you hopeful, where we're making some progress perhaps in reaching like refugee youth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can only kind of talk about, I have numbers, you can only kind of talk about refugee youth in the context of the larger youth landscape. And so I think when we think about skill building or employment down the road, or education, skill building, employment, you kind of have to look at the whole picture. And so I just wanted to share some stats that there are 1.8 billion young people right now between the ages of 10 and 24, most of them in the developing world, and 263 million children and youth are out of school, and millions more are getting kind of just rote education, not the kind of education that are actually going to give them skills to be able to be competitive in the marketplace. Young adults who've kind of all graduated out of school, there's 75 million who are not employed, not in school, and really not doing anything, again, all around the world. And so globally, we have a problem, and we're failing our young people on this unemployment issue. And there are no silver bullet solutions. And so when I was at the State Department, we spent a lot of time looking at policy issues and talking to other governments, encouraging them to elevate this issue. I mean, I think programs like what you're doing at Stevens, in the Stevens Initiative, is really important. I think where there's hope or where I've seen promise is around alliances, so the public-private sector alliances. So you've seen momentum around this with the United Nations, country governments. The World Bank has taken on a youth skills initiative, but also companies like Intel and Microsoft and others are looking for, because they're on the receiving end are not getting, they're not getting graduates who have the skills to do the jobs that they need to hire for. And so trying to strengthen that kind of funnel, that pipeline, I think has been really important internationally. Now you look at the plight of refugee youth, and I was able to travel to Jordan and visit some Syrian refugee camps. This is 7 years of this conflict. And the trend globally is just that there is more migration, more young people are moving across borders. I mean, we're seeing it in our own country. Yeah. And the children that I visited, children and young adults in refugee camps in Jordan, it's a lost generation, right? Because the host governments, or where the refugee camps are, don't have the capability to absorb that many young people, don't have the expertise, sometimes language or otherwise, to offer, proper educational training. And so I don't mean to be a downer, but this is a serious issue. And in this broader context, what happens to those young people when they're out of school now for 5, 6, 7, 8 years? I mean, I talked to a young man who left a computer science degree that he was doing to flee to safety, and so there's the whole spectrum of the socio emotional needs, their basic care, but then you think about what is a lifetime view for these young people, and it doesn't look good. It's not a good situation.
Yeah. I've been encouraged to see some of the work that's being done by the International Rescue Committee. David Miliband was here at Ideas Festival earlier in the week. He talked about their partnership with Sesame Street, funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and reaching, it was a $100 million grant they gave them to reach for one of the largest early childhood education intervention ever, and that's pretty impressive. Sal Khan has been running around Ideas Festival as well and shared some of the work that they've been doing at Khan Academy in reaching young folks who have a device and are able to access so much more knowledge. So I'm hopeful that those things will help, but in some cases they're also a drop in the bucket. Bob, I want to come back to you real quick. Obviously, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School was in your district, a very tragic situation there. What is the role of mental health in reaching students these days?
I've always been a huge proponent of social emotional learning and mental health, and how that needs to be such a larger part of the public education conversation. So it's been something that's been on the radar screen. I'll tell you, one of the things I've learned is that as you start talking about mental health, there's a stigma associated with it. People think about mental illness. We're trying to make sure that we change that. Think about it as you would your physical health. Everybody wants to be healthy, so that's something we all need to work on. Addressing things such as caseloads in terms of the number of family counselors, social workers, psychologists, and everyone that we have, those ratios are just way out of whack at anything that's reasonable. I mean, you've got hundreds to up to 1,200 per individual. That's not an effective way to actually get this done. But addressing these needs are more important today than they've ever been. We have a large percentage of students that are showing up with adverse childhood experiences in school. There are some estimates as high as 60-70% of kids in the United States are exposed to some level of trauma or challenge at home or in their community. And if you don't address those issues first, you're not going to see any real significant learning going on. The third thing I would say is that mental health services and support needs to have a continuum that extends beyond the school. I mean, it needs to be school, community, and at home. And being able to work in a coordinated way with multiple partners, mental health agencies, public health, and others, social service agencies. There's got to be better coordination, sharing of information and services to make sure that we're really providing true wraparound services to kids and their families. Again, it's more important now than ever. This isn't rocket science. We know kids in our schools that are having challenges, kids that are not connected, they're not showing up to school, they got lots of different behavior issues, and we ignore them at our peril. It's an investment that we cannot afford to ignore anymore. It's got to be on the front burner of every public education. And by the way, it transcends underserved versus high wealth, high income kids. It's all across the board. And I can tell you in Broward County, we experienced suicide rates for our kids last year. I think there were about 10 of them, if I recall. The majority of them were in our most affluent communities. So this is a nationwide problem, and we need to come together and be honest about it and begin to invest the resources to solve it.
Bob, so you talked about the resources. There's a gap there, and I want to push on this note because it seems like in so many school districts, so many superintendents, so many state leaders are saying, we don't have the funding. The caseloads are too high. We can't reach all the students. Why does there continue to be a gap on this issue?
I just think that it's a matter of prioritizing, because let me just say this. You're going to pay for it one way or another. Yeah. There's no way to avoid that. So I don't understand how, we could, at the drop of a hat, just go and spend, $1 trillion on a war. And that those numbers just keep going. Yeah. This is, we got our own internal wars here that we've got to deal with. And these are investments that we can make. They're going to have long-term payoffs for this country. So we have the resources. It's a matter of having the will to do it. I mean, this country's been really good at reacting to problems. We need to get much better in this nation at being proactive and being honest about investing money on the front side so that we can solve these issues and save ourselves a lot of pain in the long run.
And making a long-term commitment. Yeah. Making a long-term commitment, it seems like we're always driven either by quarterly Wall Street, quarterly by Wall Street, or 2 or 4 year cycles in DC. Damon, I want to jump to you, because if we're talking about long-term horizons, how are you? I know you're a young operation, but how are you guys seeing impact right on the front end with your students and the way they're leading or in the skills that they've acquired? What's that been like for you?
It's interesting. Just yesterday, I forget what session I was sitting in, I got an email from the technology coordinator and librarian, because everybody has like 8 jobs in schools, from South Shore College Prep, which is around the corner from my house. That's my neighborhood, right? And I had worked with them to get some students to apply. We have 2 young men from South Shore College Prep. And she sent me an email saying, did they join? I said, yes, they're in. They're having a blast, and they're a good fit. And she said, I've been getting these emails from the Computer Science for All team downtown, and I think I'm going to start going to those trainings because I'm going to be their faculty advisor, so I should know what they're doing, right? And so this was a top-down mandate that was very appropriate, but it was like really activated from the bottom up at South Shore College Prep. And so here you have a technology coordinator who was already busy, right? Like doing everything. It's like, what? I'll go to those trainings so I can support these young people in starting a computer science club at South Shore College Prep. So that was yesterday, right? And so
just one day.
And that's just, and if we can do that over and over again, with leadership happening and keeping that mandate downtown, I think we can make this happen.
That's great. And one of the cool things about your program is you guys have a partnership with the University of Chicago. What has that been like? Because oftentimes I think in terms of, I'm sort of a higher ed guy, a lot of institutions are criticized for being walled off, for not being involved in the community. How have you leveraged the University of Chicago's resources and talent to really propel your program?
It's interesting. Derek Douglas, the VP for Civic Engagement at the University of Chicago, came in and said, we have to change the way we engage community.
Yeah.
Instead of sending out our resources and people across a wide geography with many, many dozens of organizations, what would it mean for a university like the University of Chicago to focus on a small number of organizations and opportunities? And so they launched the Community Programs Accelerator. The idea was to accelerate existing organizations to have greater impact, to attract organizations that aren't on the South Side to the South Side. And then there was this third category of, let's find a gap and see if there's an organization that can fill it. And so I pitched that there was a gap in computer science education, and the university agreed. And they wrote I'm on camera, they wrote I won't. They supported it with capital. Not as much as I wanted, but they supported it with capital, and we had enough to run a series of experience over about 3 years.
Yeah.
They also made connections with local schools who trust the university, and so they're like, oh, Demand and Coderspace can do computer science education. We learned that school budgets are always tight and changing, so when you don't get paid, you've got to launch student clubs, right? And so we were able to learn the nature of the problem, we were able to validate our solution, and then work with our students to craft this school-based kind of youth-led model for expanding access to computer science education. So it's been capital, also space. Everybody needs space to operate, so we have a strong partnership with Polsky Exchange. It's the co-working space for the universities where they bring MBAs and research scientists together, right? And then you have these high school students spending 8 weeks in our own room at Polsky Exchange, embraced by that community. The students say, we feel like we belong here because they do. That's what we do with the university.
That's such a powerful experience for students to be able to see themselves on a college campus.
Yeah.
I've heard stories of high school teachers driving their students, putting them in a bus, taking them to Harvard's campus just so they can walk around and just so they can see themselves there. And they said a lot of schools will actually take students to jails. But this particular teacher was, I remember seeing it in the New York Times, she took her students to Harvard just to say, look, I want to change the narrative. I want to show these students that they're capable of being on a campus like this, which is really, really neat. Zeenat, I want to turn to you in the Inclusive America Project. Tell us a little bit about your work and how specifically you're drilling in on the issue of bigotry, because that's certainly something that can hold a lot of students back.
Yeah, I mean, I think relevant to this conversation, but something we haven't talked about are when we think about what are the skills that young people need to navigate the world, and we look at the hard skills, so math, science, computer science, programming, but equally important is what we call the soft skills, and I actually don't like that term, but that's how we think about them, right? Right, our executive skills. But how do you encounter difference? What do you know about somebody, who's different than you? How do you navigate that conversation? And I think it's clear kind of looking at our civil discourse in this country that we're, as adults, don't do it. We don't know how. We don't have those tools. We don't do a good job in terms of bridging difference. But yet these are essential tools that young people need. But also, when they look out kind of across this country, and especially when you think of underserved youth from minority faith backgrounds, what they see reflected in the media or in kind of the dominant conversation is not who they feel that they are, right? So I can speak kind of as a Muslim. I was with some Muslim faith leaders a few weeks ago, and I heard him say that he got two phone calls the week before of 2 kids in the community who had committed suicide.
Wow.
And so we know that kind of this increase of hate crimes, this rhetoric of villainization of certain communities is having an impact on our young people, and it's not being addressed because the mosque doesn't have resources for it. We've heard that school systems are strapped and don't have resources for it. But I do feel like this is a place where we as just lay people can also step in and realize we have communities in crisis because of this kind of these dominant, really negative rhetoric and stereotypes that are happening. And so the Inclusive America Project is focused on faith and religion because it's very misunderstood. I think many Americans are they live their life informed and driven by their faith. And I think that as Americans, we have a very low level of understanding of religious literacy of people of other faith backgrounds. And one of the things as we look at bridging divides between ideological, partisan, race, faith has to be part of that conversation. And I think it's essential that young people, especially because they're at the front lines of this. I mean, they're the ones going to school, grade school or high school, and we see the stats around this, that in high schools, hate crimes are rising or that rhetoric is rising. That's going to have a fallout, and kind of going to your earlier point that we're always so reactive. I mean, I think we need to kind of move this whole thing to not the good to do. Doing this stuff is not the stuff you do that's just nice to do, but that it's actually essential for not just a young person, but for our country and for for our competitiveness in the future. I mean, that's
communities.
the bottom line, right?
For our communities,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So I want to build on that a little bit. And one of the things that sort of struck me in some of my professional experiences, I've really learned and gotten to see how much so many of our rural communities in this country are left out and are not taken into consideration in our planning and in our policy work. Bob, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on how do we do a better job of reaching students in rural areas?
Brian Stevens always talks about being proximate. I mean, you just really need to get out there, make sure that they're part of the conversation. We have a superintendent's association in Florida. One of the beauties about the way Florida is organized, it's around counties. So we have 67 counties. So it's actually relatively easy to convene all the school districts, all the leaders, and have a conversations. And the majority of school districts in Florida are rural. But they're in the room, we're having conversations. So it's not one type of perspective or agenda from large urban type systems that dominate it. We try to make sure we strike a balance. But if we're really interested in doing that, I think we just really have to get out there and we need to have those conversations to make sure their needs are met. So for example, we're always trying to make sure that we attract teachers in Broward. And so when I think about rural areas, one of their challenges is not so much even attracting teachers, it's like where are they going to live, right? Yeah. Because they literally don't have physical housing. Forget about the disconnect in salaries versus being able to afford to live in places, but they just don't even have that. So you have to become sensitive that there may be a different set of issues while you're working in the same space that you have to be sensitive to.
You've got connectivity issues. Sometimes schools don't have
yeah.
access to the internet. Sometimes students have to be on a bus for 2 hours just to get to school, which is really problematic in terms of the learning experience.
Right, but they have to be included. Otherwise, you end up having polarized conversations, from a policy standpoint. But some of the topics that we've talked about, I think the other piece is finding those areas where we have common challenges. The mental health space is one of them. We've had 2 sessions this year. We had actually one before the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas tragedy. We had a 2-day session on social emotional learning and mental health with all the superintendents in the state. It went well. Folks really started putting things into their district. And we had a second one about a month and a half ago which involved state leaders, bringing together different state departments and agencies as well. But it's a topic that really cut across, whether you're in urban or you're in rural, we can come together on those type of issues. So finding those commonalities are also important.
That's great. Damon, I want to come back to you a little bit because it seems like your program is really changing culture for a lot of these young people. And to the earlier exchange we had, that not every student sees themselves as, I'm not going to be capable of being an engineer or a doctor. Sometimes STEM skills seem like they're out of reach for so many young people. How do we change that narrative? How do we change that culture?
Yeah, it's interesting. In 2015, our first cohort interviewed a young woman, named Brianna. She was at King College Prep. And she applied to this program, and we asked about leadership and teamwork, and that was the whole interview and stuff. We had to meet with we do a family interview. It's really just a one-to-one meeting, so you can't fool me. We've had cousins call saying, "I'm so-and-so's grandmother." It's like, no, your voice is way too young. And I know your grandmother, and I'm going to act like, she actually called me, so I'm going to call her back until I got her message, and then that'll handle itself. But that's only happened once. Anyway, Brianna came in and, joined the program, and she was very cautious. Working in teams was not something that she had a good experience with. Yeah. She was more into the literature and the arts, but she was curious. And later she said she never saw herself in STEM. This is a brilliant young woman. She was elected by her team to be team leader, right, within like 3 weeks of the program. We brought her back the next year to be the lead teaching assistant. And I can say, like literally today and yesterday, she is an instructor at Coderspace. She's wrapping up her second year at city colleges. She's getting out her prerequisites. And she's finding a way to combine her interest in computer science with her interest in writing, right? And so we're working together to craft this interactive fiction session that we're going to do, where students can write a story, but also write the code that makes the story interactive, choose your own adventure. And those types of connections are how we're going to bring more students in. We're partnering with the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. They have these high altitude balloons that go up to the edge of space. So our students during spring break programmed little sensors, sent them up to the edge of space, and then collected data, came down, and then used Python and Google Collaboratory, which is like a Jupyter notebook, for those of you who know what that is, and analyzed the data, right, from the sensors that they programmed themselves. Right, and so if you're not interested in like coding and computer science, you might be interested in going to space, and that's the hook. If you're not interested in coding computer science, but you like writing, you might want to build a game, like an interactive fiction game. So that's how we're making it more accessible. And the students are giving us all these ideas, by the way.
Great.
Yeah, it's all the program model, this idea, this is all them.
That's awesome. Well, I've got one question for you guys. Actually, let's take some questions from the audience, and I'll come back to you guys with a final question. So I think this gentleman had his hands up first. Go ahead. Sure. We got a mic coming around for you.
If I may. So, my name is Linda Resnick. We own the wonderful company, but we do a lot in education. We deal with about 64 school districts in the Central Valley of California, the underserved areas there. And I wondered, a lot of our children, when they come to us, even in kindergarten, are so far behind socially and emotionally. What are you doing 0 to 3? Do you have any programs in your area?
Yeah, so what we've done for 0 to 3 is work with the Early Childhood Coalition and some other partners in the community, not only to just advance the programs that we have, including Head Start, but work with over 700 providers that are in the community. That is where the challenge is, right? So what we've done is we offer them free professional development, so they don't have to pay for it. So whenever we have sessions for our own staff, they can come in. We also have them come into the early primary school so they can get some sense of expectation of what we expect the kids to learn and how they should be prepared when they show up at school. And then we also send staff out to these providers to actually look at things such as, what's the curriculum look like? How are they organized in their rooms? So we believe that we're not going to be able to have every kid in the system. We don't have a 0 to 3 system, but we need to actually go out where they are and start helping and supporting them. So that's kind of what our strategy is, and we believe if we continue to do that, the young children that show up are going to be better prepared. Then our challenge is to make sure that they start out prepared, that they continue to grow and don't dive down while they're going through the system.
That's a great question. I think this gentleman right here had his hand up first. Come back to you, sir.
Thank you, Bush Hellsberg. And my question is just around, you talked about the need for more resources in the traditional public school systems. And yet, I read about hundreds of schools across the country that are serving underserved or underprivileged kids and are getting amazing results. So my question is there something about our, the way we're managing schools that needs to be done different? If some schools are doing it with these kids, why can't that be a much more broader phenomenon?
So let me say you can go to any district and you could find, as they say, pockets of success. And anyone can always create some narrative around that. But to your point, I don't believe you should be throwing good money after a bad situation. There are things that you need to do. I'll give you an example. In most systems, from what I've seen, you take school leaders, your principals. I've yet to see a principal that's a star principal in an A-rated school that's going to show up on my doorstep and say, hey, you know what? I want to go and work over at this chronically failing school over here for like the same thing. So recognize, and a lot of my career before I got in education, I worked in the private sector. And what we would do, we would put our most talented people on our most challenging projects. And so what I started doing a couple of years ago is identifying who our best principals are on a big matrix, look at a bunch of criteria, and I would invite them in, and I'd offer them a deal. Look, I'll pay you $25,000 a year on top of what you already make to go to this school. You stay there for 5 years, you get these results, and you will get this money. So they took it, it works. We've seen these schools move. It's been amazing. But we also got to take care of the teachers, right? So we offer financial incentives to the teachers, and we've been doing some of that. We were fortunate this past year to be the only urban system in the country that was able to secure a TIF-5 grant, a Teacher Incentive Fund grant, for $53.8 million. We've taken that $53.8 million, focused it on 33 schools, where we're paying teachers anywhere from 5, 10, yeah, you make about 10 on the low end, but you could make as much as $20,000 a year on top of what you would already make at a traditional school. In the past, we offered incentives like a couple $1,000s. By the time you paid and covered mileage and taxes, it just wasn't worth it. So we offer some real significant differential, and we've been able to not only attract more experienced, higher performing teachers, but they've been staying at the school. Attendance rates have been up for teachers, not just the students, but the teachers themselves, and the vacancies are significantly down, and we see those schools moving. But that's shifting resources around, but again, you still need more resources into many of those schools. When you look at these underserved, high poverty schools, they've got a lot of needs. We talked about mental health. These kids, you know, we end up serving 3 meals a day. They need vision services we provide to them. We need a nurse in every one of these schools that it helps. So it's really putting those dollars to good use to recognize that in order for our teachers to do the job they need to do, we have all these other needs that the students have, and we can't burden the teachers with that. It's just too much.
Thank you for that. Let's go with a question in the back here. We'll come back to the side.
So I live in the Detroit area, and I happen to go to a great suburban school district. My kids went to a very good private school in Ann Arbor, and I rotated in the Leadership Detroit program, spent time in the Detroit public schools, in our top performing suburban schools. And the expectations that I came out with was, we've got a problem and the people are serving on the boards and the state committees because the equity and the equitable distribution is a problem. Detroit public schools need 10 times more than the suburbs do because they have 10 times the need. But every election cycle, they change the new paradigm. Charter schools are going to come in, this person going to come in, this person going to come in. But there's no consistency to change the perception on our end who are voting or on these boards or donating as a company or our family foundation does. How do you convey the needs of these children back to the broader population so we can actually support them in a way that's sustainable long term? Because in my sense, my conclusion was Detroit public schools kids get around 7,500, effectively only 3,000 because the schools are in such disrepair, and they probably need around 15 to 20,000 per child. But am I missing that? Because I feel the problem's with me rather than with the school district.
No, that's probably correct. I think you've got a new, well, I guess he's going into the second year now. Nikolai Vidi's the superintendent there. You know, I think we've got to find ways to invite people to come into the school system. I believe schools belong to the community. I know in Broward we have over 40,000 volunteers that work in the schools, but I think inviting in the business community, finding ways for them to actually help develop innovative programs so kids can apply what they're learning to real world problems. But just finding creative ways to get the community into the school and connect it to what the schools are doing. That is actually part of the job description now of a principal. You put the right principal in the school, a large part of their job is building relationships, not just in the school, but outside the schools with elected officials, businesses, and so on, making sure that those connections, those relationships are there. So you just got to work at it from a larger level, but I think we've got to really make that a large part of a school principal's job.
That's right. Let's take a question from this side of the room. Lady in the back. We'll come back to you.
Yes, when you do incentive pay for these teachers to move to these schools, do you not run into trouble with the union?
Oh, no, we don't, because when we do this, we actually work with the union up front. Look, our unions understand that there's a heavier lift in some schools than others. So they've been on board with that. I think there's a larger issue when it comes to teacher pay and compensation. We've seen these strikes all over the country. I mean, our teachers are just grossly underpaid for the amount of work that they're doing, and that's got to change. They shouldn't have to go and shut down whole states in order to be acknowledged and get some decent compensation so they can afford to live and pay the bills. I also believe that we need to start thinking about teaching as a real profession so that it's year-long. It's not just a 10-month gig, but they're paid for an entire year. Over the summer, they're doing professional development. They're looking at data. They're developing lesson plans. They're getting ready for the next year. That's what we got to do.
Take a question over here.
Thank you all for all of your work. I want to know, what are the greatest threats to the longevity, sustainability to a lot of the programs that you all are doing with the underserved youth? I find myself working with a lot of these youth, and I'm having to deal more with the threats than I am a lot of times to the vision.
Damani, you want to start?
I'll share. What type of threats?
Well, yeah.
So, for instance, I'm in rural communities. We're teaching kids how to code. From infrastructure, from political issues, I mean, there's all type of things that kind of come across the desk every day just to work with, some kids after school. So I just want to know what type of challenges that you're facing.
I can jump in and share actually with the Stevens Initiative. We're on this wonderful program at the Aspen Institute, and I'd encourage everybody to take a look at our website. For us, one of the best things from a planning perspective has been that we've had wonderful partners that have committed to long-term funding for us, and that has certainly been helpful in terms of from a planning perspective. We also have a few governments on board, obviously the U.S. government, bless you, the State Department, the governments of the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, and they're able to help give us more access into the schools. That's really been helpful. But I will say, because our program is international in nature, sometimes I do get a little nervous about what is happening in the world and how that affects perception of one another, and then our ability to empower our partners to do work in schools. That's something that, from an international perspective, worries me a little bit about some of our work in the Stevens Initiative. But generally speaking, things have progressed along because much of our framing, while we think a lot about empathy development for the students who are participating in the Stevens Initiative, that's kind of the underpinning of our work, in addition to the skill development that I think Zeenat had mentioned, that we want kids to develop 21st century skills, that empathy isn't just a fluffy thing. This is something that is helpful if you're going to go work in a Fortune 500 company, if you're going to go be a school teacher, in any profession. This is really important. This is a skill. So we framed a lot of our work around that, and it's actually been really helpful to get us in the door. So I would say one thing to consider in terms of mitigating risk is look at your framing. That's been very helpful for us at the Stevens Initiative. I don't know if you all have anything else to share.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I think about on that is stability in governance and what that means, right? So, as was mentioned over in Detroit, and you constantly have turmoil, changes in leadership and governance. I mean, you can't get a coherent strategy in place. So that becomes a challenge. I've been in Broward now for 7 years, which is a long time for a large urban superintendent. But I believe you need to spend that kind of time, 10 years even, a whole generation of kids, 12 years, in order to make a difference. But one thing I would say is that these strategies and initiatives should not be connected to necessarily individuals like a superintendent. The community needs to own it. So when you have changes, you have stability and focus. And so sometimes I think that gets lost when the new, the new lady or the new guy comes in. You got new strategy coming around, but if the community owns it at a lot of different levels, it can be sustained for the long run. So I think that's a large part of what we got to do is make sure people buy into it.
So I'm going to take the last question selfishly, and I'm going to ask it to the three of you guys. Give me a quick 30-second response. What leaves you most optimistic looking forward? Zeenat, why don't you go ahead and start?
I'll start because I bet we'll all have the same answer, which is the young people themselves. Obviously, they are not afraid to jump in and tackle problems. We're seeing that on national issues. We're seeing that locally. I've seen that through all the work that I've done. And, and I just encourage every single one of us in the audience. I think we have a responsibility and an imperative to reach out to young people in our community, listen, be there for them, talk to them, show them that there's a bigger world than the one that they might see in that moment.
Yeah.
I would agree with that 100%. I would say that, during the darkest days and most difficult storms that you face, you always had that before you get to brighter days and sunshine. And I believe that we're seeing some of that with our kids. You've seen kids from Stoneman Douglas who've gone through enormous tragedy and heartbreak, how they've responded. And I think that's inspiring for all of us in this country. They're tackling all kinds of problems. We should look at that and then look at the things that we're trying to get done, and realize that anything is possible if we come together, especially if we involve the youth on it.
Last word.
Yeah, same thing, the young people. If we listen to them, they're telling us exactly what we need to do.
That's awesome. Well, folks, please join me in thanking our wonderful audience for their comments. This has been great and exciting.